let's start with a big welcome to all of you. Thanks for coming. I would like to thank the people that made this Aula-Live possible. Many thanks to Editora PUC-Rio, Felipe Gomberg and his wonderful team for this invitation to open this very special seminar. Congratulations to this initiative and support for such event in a reinvention of the academic meeting for times of social isolation. Thanks for all my students for the inspiration to organize this special meeting. This Aula-Live is part of the graduate course on communication at PUC-Rio. The discipline COM 2011, Introduction to Media Ecology, Technology and Culture. Thanks for the audience here. I can see many friends and colleagues from different regions of Brazil that are coming to like Júlio Diniz, Arthur Ituaçu, and many others. And today we welcome a more than special guest, a colleague, a partner of whom I have a honor of co-authoring the book in question in this meeting, and a long-standing friend. Thank you, Lance Strate, for your availability, for honoring our course. And first I will present you. Okay, Lance Strate is a New York writer and professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University, a PhD in media ecology from New York University. He is internationally recognized for his intellectual leadership in the discipline of communication, with a scholarship focused on the development of media ecology as a field of inquiry, with special attention to the work of Marshall McLuhan, Walter Ong, and Neil Postman, on the historical relationship between modes of communication and social cultural phenomena. He is the author of dozens of books on the fields of media ecology, including Echoes and Reflections on Media Ecology as a Field of Study from 2006, on the Binding Biases of Time and Other Essays on General Semantics and Media Ecology from 2011, Amazing Ourselves to Death from 2013, and Media Ecology, an approach to understanding the human condition, 2017. Strate is the author and co-author of many books, including books of poetry, and editor or co-editor of many others. Translation of his work have appeared in French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Hungarian, Hebrew, Mandarin, and according to Wikipedia, the fictional Elvish language. Lance Strate is one of the founders and the first president of the Media Ecology Association. He is active in a number of other organizations and a member of the editorial board of several journals. He has received many awards in recognition for exceptional scholarship, leadership, and dedication to the field of communication. At Fordham University, Professor Strate maintains an active research program that includes investigations on technological innovation and social cultural change, investigating the relationship between media and conceptions of space, time, self, and consciousness, religion, and culture. For this conversation with Professor Strate, we have two distinguished guests, Luís Mauro Martino, professor of the graduate program of communication on the Faculdade Cásper Líbero, a PhD in social science at PUC São Paulo, author of many books, to name some: Ethics, Media and Communication, Methods of Communication Research, Theory of Digital Media, The Mediatization of Religion, Theory of Communication, Communication and Identity, and so on. He is also the author of the preface of our book, Introdução, Ecologia das Mídias, da Edições Loyola, launched in 2019. And the second guest is Professor Edgar Lyra. Edgar Lyra is a bachelor in chemical engineering and PhD in philosophy. He is the Dean of the Department of Philosophy at PUC-Rio. He has experience in the field of contemporary philosophy, especially in ethical, political, and pedagogical problems linked to the current technological hegemony and its environmental effects. His primary reference authors are Martin Heidegger and Hannah Arendt, around which his publications are concentrated. He created and leads the group of studies in research in philosophy and technology and a research group on education and technology in partnership with researchers from the Department of Education in PUC-Rio. He is strongly convinced of the need to train philosophy teachers capable of dealing with the demands of the technical age. He has dedicated himself to the study of rhetoric with political pedagogical intentions, starting from Aristotle rhetoric towards its contemporary echoes. I am Adriana Braga, an associate professor of the graduate program of social communication PUC-Rio, a researcher of the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development, and vice president of the Media College Association. Among my published books, I am honored to be co-author with Lance Strate and Paul Levinson of the book Introdução, Ecologia das Mídias, Editora Loyola and PUC-Rio. To start this conversation, I would like to ask a first question.
Adriana, excuse me, sorry. Before starting the conversation, I would like to say that our new vice president, our new vice rector, Father Anderson Pedroso, is with us. That's very, for us,
thank you.
Thank you, Father Anderson, for your presence.
Okay.
Thanks, Father Anderson Pedroso, for your presence.
Thank you, Julio.
Thanks, Julio. I will take a look. People are coming. Following Lance's reply, I will call Professor Martino. After Lance's reply, it will be the time for Professor Edgar Lyra. After this first round, there will be time for questions from the audience. If someone wants to ask a question to Professor Strate, it can be written in Portuguese in the chat box. And Jadna, our PhD student, to whom we thank for this wonderful help, she will translate it and pass for the question over to Dr. Strate or others. And those who want to address their question in English, use the raise hand button in the participants box, and I will be called, you'll be called one by one, okay? So, after this introduction, Professor Strate, could you tell us about how you got started on your career as a mediacologist and some of your influences?
Some of my what? I'm sorry.
Influences.
Oh, influences.
Influences, okay.
Well, it's hard to say how I got started because I can go back to elementary school where, you know, I had, you know, some interesting books that I read about language, and, you know, I was looking back on one of them. I was delighted to see that there was actually a page on the alphabet and a page on the printing press. So I realized that it really goes back to very early on. You know, plus, you know, we were talking before about, I mean, we just celebrated Yom Kippur, which is the end of the New Year season, and growing up learning a different alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, and also going by a different calendar. This is the year 5781. It makes you think about different symbol systems, different ways of You know, not just different content representations as somebody, you know, some particular group portrayed as good or bad, but different ways, methods of representing things. So I think that was there early on, you know, and, you know, plus I grew up in a multilingual environment, which unfortunately, having grown up as an American means didn't catch on for me very much. And I'm sorry I don't speak other languages like Portuguese, which is such a lovely language. But I probably heard of McLuhan when I was in high school. I don't remember offhand, but a popular book at that time was, I know, like circa 1970, was Future Shock by Alvin Toffler, and that started to just bring in questions, although it was not very much in depth, it started to bring in questions. And it was my first course as a first-year student, my first semester as an undergraduate at Cornell University, and it was a professor, Jack Barwin, who is no longer alive, who just, it was Introduction to Communication. And so much of media ecology was in there. He didn't use that term, it wasn't as widely known. Really just been introduced a couple of years before that, but you know, it included McLuhan and Harold Innis and Daniel Borston, who was really very important, and Jacques Ellul on technology. And also some of the softer kinds of elements like general systems theory and general semantics that are very much a part of the media ecology tradition. So that kind of got me started, and then you know, having that interest, I went on for my master's at Queens College with Gary Gumpert, who's still around, and he introduced me to others like Walter Ong, who became very important. I would say that Walter Ong was of people who are not directly in, my teachers, was my most important influence as a scholar. Marshall McLuhan was very inspiring, and then going on for my PhD, studying with Neil Postman was very important, and also his colleague Christine Nystrom, who doesn't get enough credit because she didn't publish that much, but there are actually 2 volumes of her writings that will be coming out, one in the near future. This is posthumously, of course. So, you know, they both really helped to shape my thinking to be more rigorous about how I was both thinking and conducting scholarship, and also to be better writers. And Postman was a great speaker, public speaker as well. So that he was a great model for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Luís Mauro.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Adriana. You know, I'm feeling deeply honored to be here, and good afternoon to everyone else. It's such a pleasure to meet all those colleagues. Some of them I've been reading through the years, and now for the first time I have a glimpse in 2D. The best would be in 3D. I would like very much to be with you at PUC-Rio, but unfortunately we have to keep the social distance. But anyway, I'm really grateful to be here and to meet Professor Strate. I'm really glad to meet you after reading some of your texts. It's really fantastic to hear, you know, personally, as much as personally is virtually. And my first question is, 40 years ago, when we talked about media, we meant mostly mass media, television and radio and movies. So then there comes the internet and a lot of new concepts, words and concepts like digital media, old and new media, cyber media, and so on. A lot of names and concepts emerged. Some of them were really ephemeral, quickly disappearing throughout the research and the theses and dissertations and papers, and other more permanent. My question is there still a point in using names and concepts like this is there still a point of talking about old and new media, or digital and analogic media, or is media a concept that encompasses all of that? Is there a point of making those classifications, or when we talk about media, especially when we talk about media environment, we're talking about a new idea of media that I would like to ask you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, I'd say that it's both are correct, you know, in the sense that there is the all-encompassing idea of media, which really can include just about anything. It's a way of looking at things rather than a way of categorizing things. But then we can break things down into categories within the larger category of media. And it's funny you said 40 years ago, because I'm thinking, well, that's 1980. But if you go back to 1964, I think that's really the point where Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media suddenly, and it seems sudden, explodes the concept of media so that it's not just the mass media. And that's kind of a simple thing that many people in communication were chafing under, because the telephone never fit in, right? Who studies the telephone? If you're in mass media, you don't study the telephone because it's not used for mass communication. If you're in interpersonal communication, you don't study the telephone because that's defined in that area as face-to-face communication, not mediated. And it's not until we get to into the 80s with the prevalence of email, not quite reaching the popular point in the 90s, but being used more and more in organizations. You know, that's where we start to get this interest in computer-mediated communication and just that general category of the kind of interpersonal mediated communication. But that's like a kind of a small thing in the sense that McLuhan defined forms of transportation as media, and he equated a medium with a technology. Any technology, and ultimately any human invention or innovation. And it's also before the 1980 that he's working on laws of media, which only a couple of very short articles come out, but when it's finally published, you know, that his son Eric McLuhan finishes it, completes it, and it's published, I think it was in '87, that it gets extended to every kind of innovation. So the periodic table, for example, is a medium, or hermeneutics is a medium, you know, that all of these things, any human creation, is a medium. The only place he didn't want to go, by the way, was the human body itself. And I believe that was a mistake. I think it was out of a sense of trying to separate the artificial from the natural. But it's very clear that biology also functions as a medium. So that's like kind of like the big picture. When I taught, I haven't been teaching it lately, but I used to teach a kind of introduction to new media. And it was always this question of how can you call it new media? It's been around since, and you know, you can say the 90s, or even trace it back to the 80s or to the 70s with video games and that sort of thing. So what's so new about it? And I would explain that the contrast is to mass media. It's media that are not mass media and that can be used either interpersonally or for mass communication, or also for a kind of many-to-many function that doesn't, it's not that it's unheard of, but you can have like a big group meeting, a town hall meeting, but it's very hard to have that very workable and for increasingly large numbers, but online suddenly that becomes a major mode of communication. So that's where I think it's a useful category. But we always have to remember that categories are human creations. In general semantics, we talk about the process of abstracting, and when you are putting things into categories and you're leaving out details that may be significant. So you have to remember that you're doing that, and also that there's you're making a decision when you put things into categories. So as you said, I mean, we could call it digital media versus new media. They have different implications because film today, the cinema today is largely digital, right? Popular music is largely digital. So they have different senses to them. They overlap, but they're different kinds of categories. So we make the choices, and it's useful because it directs our attention, our research, but we have to remember that we've created these categories and not reify them.
Thank you, Lance. And there is an additional problem here in Brazil because in English, media is a plural word. In Portuguese, we translate for media, and is a singular. It's not plural; it's a singular. So it's terrible because we don't have the word medium. Only media, and media is singular. So you think all media as one block of things sometimes.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a problem with our students because they start to think, I mean, it's become not unusual, I mean, to force English writers, even in the popular press, or some scholars to write media and use it as a singular noun, a collective. And that's horrifying.
Yes, it's terrible because we call all kind of media as the media.
Yeah.
It was only one thing. So thank you for this reflection about the categorization and translation. Thank you very much. Edgar Lyra, please. Your mic? I have. Oh,
you have to unmute me.
Okay,
you, the host. Yeah.
But I have other hosts here around me.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you, Adriana, for inviting me to be with you, with Professor Luís Martino, and especially with Professor Lance Strate and all the students, graduates and undergraduates. I was not sure about the dynamics of our meeting, thus I prepared a couple of writing questions that I can address or not as needed. It's reasonable to imagine that colleagues and students may wish equally to formulate questions. To be transparent, only recently, since Adriana invited me to help with the organization of the next Media Ecology Association annual convention, I've been reading texts and watching videos on media ecology. It is indeed a quiet philosophical field of inquiry, as long as we don't understand philosophy as a set of classical currents or disciplines. Nevertheless, I must apologize in advance if I pose obvious or recurrent questions. My purpose is just to give rise for Professor Strate to talk from a media ecology perspective about some important general themes. My first question is a rather long and provocative one, and is concerned with the film Social Dilemma, just produced and released by Netflix. If my understanding is correct, the main task for a media ecologist since Neil Postman is to think media as environment and environments as media. Media ecologists then talk about building narratives, poetic, literary, artistic, and philosophical, that make us more aware of the forces, stuff, and discourses that condition our existence at any given time. Well, social dilemma seems to be such a kind of action. As you indeed know, some former important assets of Google, Facebook, Twitter boldly pointed out serious problems concerned with the actual development of those media and the power of conditioning our lives. Surprisingly, huge criticism has been driven against the film. The main critic is that they don't stress the necessity of the regulation of those media. To put the question in its level of complexity, I want to remind a former similar episode when California state tried to forbid violent video games to be sold to users under 18 years old. The discussion climbed up to the Supreme Court, where Californian legislation has been dropped down. The decision has been grounded both in the constitutional freedom of speech and in the disqualification of the research that stands that there is a link between playing violent games and real violence. To conclude, the question of regulation is indeed important, but it's worth thinking also about the legal and political difficulties of fostering such regulation. Be that as it may, it's true that the film highlights important issues as the growing autonomy of this technological and symbolical apparatus, their addicting power, and so on. Excuse me for the long question. I just want to hear you about this imbroglio.
Well, first of all, please don't, no need to apologize for long questions. That lets me relax for a while. I have to confess that I have not seen The Social Dilemma yet. Some of my students are talking about it, but if I understand you correctly, the big, sort of the more general question is about regulating or putting in, doing anything to try to put some control over media of communication. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. You know, to that point, you know, say that, you know, when we think about media ecology, you know, and the idea of ecology, there is this question of what we should do with media. And, you know, of course we can just let it run free. And that is actually how capitalism functions, you know, that it essentially seeks a kind of unregulated environment for technological innovation. But from a media ecology point of view, you know, we have to ask, well, maybe there should be limits on what we do, and the limits can be personal. You know, it's like your choice to make these decisions, but there also are kind of, if you like, social and for us then political issues that can be brought up. You know, think about things in biblical terms, and you know, go back to the Ten Commandments, and Postman first brought this up about the what is, you know, the Ten Commandments are not numbered, so actually different religions parse them differently. But we, you know, in the U.S. we tend to go with the Protestant version of it, and the second commandment is no images, no graven images. And Postman points out, and amusing ourselves to death, that this was an attempt to control the media environment, to say that images, visual images, have a negative impact on people's thinking ability. And this coming at a time when the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, the Semitic alphabet, is a new innovation. And how do we get people to adopt it? How do we get people to be readers instead of just being listeners, but also paying attention to images to the extent of worshiping them? I was just talking about this because we were discussing understanding media, and in one of the passages, McLuhan quotes a psalm. I forgot the number now, maybe 116 or 118, but it's the one that says that their idols are made of gold and silver. They have mouths, but they don't talk. They have eyes, but they don't see. And it culminates with, they who worship them shall become like them. Which was something that really, kind of resonated. McLuhan's colleague, Edmund Carpenter, did a book, They Became What They Beheld, which that title comes from that psalm. And it's the idea that when we adopt certain media, they feed back into us and we become like them. But I pointed out iconoclasm has a long history in all of the Abrahamic religions. In the Jewish religion, we consider the fact that there have been very few Jewish artists until we get to the 20th century. It suppressed artistic creativity, visual arts. In Christianity, the early church went through a very tumultuous period of fighting over religious iconography. And again, with the Protestant Reformation, which condemned the Catholic use of visual imagery. And when you get to Islam, we find, really in some versions, a very extreme attack on images. Some may remember that some months before 9/11, in the US, the Taliban in Afghanistan blew up, destroyed 2 enormous statues of the Buddha. And also, when ISIS had its caliphate, at a certain point, they were destroying artifacts from antiquity. And again, it's part of this iconoclastic sense. So, we obviously see this as overly extreme, but by the same token, and Eric Havelock pointed out about ancient Greece, why did Plato want to exclude the poets? Because oral tradition and poetry, song, was a competing form of education, and he was trying to create a literate culture. So the attempt to control the media environment and put limits on it has been with us throughout history. We just haven't recognized it as such. And Postman himself did make some appeals. This is, I guess, in the 80s, when in Europe, where there was public television, television broadcasting was completely under government control, unlike the US, and more limited because of that. And he tried to give reasons why they should not go over to commercial television. It's because the idea that under commercial, private, control, it's unfettered. Whereas with government control, there were limits. They wouldn't broadcast 24 hours a day. They wouldn't just broadcast whatever is most profitable. So the idea of putting some limits on things is not a terrible concept. And there are regulations anyway, but obviously when it comes especially to print media, we have this particularly long-standing sense of freedom of the press, and I would point to the idea that it's about the press as opposed to broadcasting or electronic media. And so I don't know if this really gives you, I mean, it's not, I don't have a specific policy proposal to pull out, but I think that some idea of limits, if we understand that we're in a media environment, we have to think about what's the best use of things. And the last thing I'll say, I mean, when I teach a class on media ecology with undergraduates, where I have them just look at, try to do a relatively objective analysis of, and it's in a new media kind of program. And I just say, for your conclusion, what are the useful applications of the medium or media that we're talking about? Or what are the appropriate applications? What's appropriate, what's not appropriate? And that's what we should be thinking about. Again, that's on the regulatory side. On the individual side, you can certainly stress to people that there are times when you should just turn the damn things off, right? Just turn them off for a bit, but that's a different story. That actually relates to the Sabbath too. The idea of just taking a rest from technology as well, because it is a kind of labor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lance. It's a really big issue. If you want to continue, Edgar, you can go ahead because we have no questions here.
You have no questions?
No, from my students, no, from the audience. Come on, people.
And what about Luís?
Luís Mauro?
Yes, I'm here, but, well, if there are other questions, that would be really welcome.
Yes, but no questions from the audience, so go ahead.
Paula,
well, I'd like to ask one more. One of my students, when some time ago we were talking about media and communication and the very concept of media and communication. And after a while, she came to a very interesting question. She said, okay, so if everything is media and everything is communication, how can we draw a line? Is it possible to draw a line in what is not media or what is not communication? Is there anything that that cannot be considered a sort of medium to communicate? And if everything is communication or everything is a medium, how can we sort out how to study these things? Because if we conceive everything as a medium, we face a very difficult problem to define our field of inquiry, because communication or media studies will become probably one of the biggest or the most complex inquiry field. So that's my question. How can we reduce our field of inquiry? And why am I asking that? Because when we are going to, to search for, even for financial support, they ask us, okay, what is media in your research? Why is it located in media studies? So that's my question. I've been asked this question. I don't know if I really answered that in the occasion, so I'm passing on to you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Well, it's certainly a fair question, and it's one of the problems. I think ultimately we either do things, we have to know a lot about a lot and do things really well, or very shallow, very, very superficially. I think Edgar, as having looked at rhetoric, I mean, you can go back to Aristotle, where he's saying that, on the one hand, rhetoric has no subject matter of its own, but on the other hand, it's about everything else.
Yes.
Although McLuhan, I think, rightly made the point that it's less, I mean, that's communication rhetoric, but media ecology is more a function of grammar than rhetoric, grammar in the ancient and medieval sense. But I think for communication is an easier one to answer because things are I mean, especially if we limit to human communication, which is typically what we do. So if there are no human beings around, there's no communication going on. And, you know, so it becomes a function of human behavior, or of understanding human behavior and human thought. You know, I just, yesterday, passing some time, I was reading some Martin Buber, and he talks about how creation is speech. You know, that is, all of creation is a form of speech. It's the world speaks to us. So, and I was going like, yeah, you know, I wish I had come across that earlier, because you know, I can think of a place where I could have included that in something I was working on. But, and that's not that far afield from Norbert Wiener, the MIT scientist who introduced cybernetics, and basically said the environment is a series of, to whom it may concern, messages. You know, that's from the point of view of information. So, yeah, I think a lot depends on whether it is or is not communication, but how do we look at it? How are we trying to understand what it is? And so, say to a physicist, the universe is not so much communication, except for some of the way out ones who think the universe is a computer or a hologram or whatever. But you know, for most, it's not. You know, they're not looking at it. They're not asking those kind of questions. For media, you know, first of all, I'd say that it's about, you know, again, what are we looking at? So if we are looking at, say, this Zoom as a medium, then what's being said here is the content of that. But we could also look at language as a medium within, you know, that's appearing within this medium, and ask about that, or the English language specifically. So I always relate it to systems theory, and so there are systems within systems within systems, and it depends on which point, you know, what point we're looking at things. What makes for an environment depends on what you're looking at. Whatever you're looking at, what surrounds it is its environment. It's not an absolute concept. I mean, I think, Luis, in terms of your problem, I don't know if you're still there, your camera's gone, but I would certainly start by limiting to media of communication. We understand that to be a subset of a larger category of media. You know, and that's how we sort of avoid the problem. But relating media to environment, it's whatever the environment is that, you know, becomes the medium. I found very interesting, this was just from an interview with McClellan, but I thought it was very useful. The idea that, say, between affluence, being rich and being poor, that rich is the environment, or if you like, the medium that creates poverty. That there is no poverty until there are rich people, that affluence, you know, creates poverty. Poverty doesn't create affluence, right? So you know, affluence is the environment out of which poverty emerges. And it's like a dialectic, but you know, if you went to Saussure, he would just say rich and poor are, you know, binary oppositions and they define each other, but no, it's one is the medium and then one becomes the message. So this becomes a way of thinking about things. What is the medium, and then what comes out of it is the message, and the message is then not the medium, it's something else. I don't know if that helps you, Luis. I don't know if you're still there. Did he disappear?
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much, Professor. That's really clearing off the things. Thank you.
Okay.
May I pose one more question, Adriana?
Yes, please, Edgar.
Okay, maintaining my focus in this broad conception of media, I want to talk about climate change. Climate change, or climate collapse, as someone prefer, is one of the most important political topics in the present day. Peter Sloterdijk is a very well-known philosopher, has even said that all political philosophies must be today concerned with climate change. I shall ask you, considering sharing words like environment and ecology, about the possible contribution of media ecology studies to the debate more visibly led by authors like Bruno Latour, Isabelle Stanguer, Dipesh Chakrabarty, and so on.
Well, I think that it's important to include the, say, biophysical environment, that that media ecology as an intellectual tradition has done so. And, so for example, you could go back to the writing of Lewis Mumford, and he is, he wrote very eloquently about the natural, so to speak, environment, and, the problems that we face. So for example, one of the most challenging things for those of us who are, who grew up with the space program and that sort of inspiration that it brought of going to the moon and all of that, is that he was very critical of all of that back in the 60s. That he said, we're spending all of this money, and and he compared it to the Egyptians building the pyramids to send the select few to their concept of heaven, of the heavens. So that's what we're doing by shooting a bunch of guys up into the, into outer space, when there are so much more pressing concerns going on here. So I think, what media ecology is about is a holistic way of thinking about things, and that we need to understand that. And it includes a critique of technology, not just of, say, new media or broadcasting, but of all technology, and why are we doing what we're doing. I find Jacques Ellul, just to mention another key thinker, very, very powerful on this, because he says in our kind of sort of technical oriented society, technological society, uses the French term la technique, which doesn't translate to English properly, but it is that we're driven by technical considerations above all. And that means efficiency. What's the most efficient means to any end? And it's impossible then, under these conditions, to argue for things that are good in and of themselves. So when I explain this to students, I say, think about save the rainforest. I guess this is one that comes very close to home for you folks. But for us, it's, it's a cause célèbre, right? Save the rainforest. Why? What are the reasons reasons they give to save the rainforest. So I asked them, and they come up with things like it provides oxygen for the planet. In other words, it's like a factory that produces oxygen. Or come up, they find new kinds of medicines in the rainforest. It's always about its productivity. And then I point out, if you were to say, save the rainforest because it's a good thing to do, because it's the right thing to do, or because we should preserve all of God's creation, right? Now, I'm not trying to be religious here, I'm just trying to point out that that kind of argument doesn't work. I mean, it works for select groups of people, but as a broad sort of, social argument, you can't make those sort of arguments. So we're always reduced to technical criteria. And then what are the solutions then that come out of it? And Alul's analysis is we solve technical problems by introducing more technology. Right? We never say stop, let's not do something. We introduce more technology. So now, based on this analysis, all right, here's my prediction. We may live to see this, I don't know. But my prediction is that, they're already doing this stuff, but they're going to try to do it. I think China's been doing some of this. It's going to be geoengineering. What are they going to do to solve global warming? They're going to do, the basic thing is to throw a lot of junk into the atmosphere to block out the sun and cool the planet down. Right? That is going to be the solution that they come up with when things get to the point of being intolerable, as they seem to inevitably will happen, which may solve some of the problem, may not. If anyone's seen Snowpiercer, any of the versions of that science fiction scenario, it's based on the idea that that's what we do when we wind up in a new ice age because it was too much. But that's what we're going to do, right? We're not going to stop just doing things. We're not going to, there was this wonderful thing that came out of Italy, a YouTube video, and they did an English version that was just like a letter from COVID. And it was just, it was just about, stop, look what's happening. And it was like, suddenly everyone stopped doing things and the world, things started to improve with the environment. But, if we understand, this analysis suggests that we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to keep trying to solve this through more and more technology, which will create more and more problems, because like every innovation creates new problems. Now that sounds sort of hopeless. And, Edgar, maybe you're looking for something more hopeful, but, perhaps if we all understood this, we might think differently. And Alul was from the Reformed Protestant Church, and he was actually a theologian. And so, he actually suggested it's sort of like something, would take some kind of revelation to break us out of this. I don't know. It might just be like catastrophe that does it, though. But I think that's the bottom line, is we're going to keep going the way we are until things become so catastrophic that it can't be ignored. And then we'll see where it goes. But I'm predicting they're going to start doing that. They're going to start shooting junk into the atmosphere to try to blot out, try to cool the planet off, because that's how we do things.
Thank you, Lance.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just going to say, I know that, there's a desire to find alternatives and find things to do. And we have a saying, forewarned is forearmed. Maybe we can put a halt to it by, realizing that. But, for my part, I just try to analyze the situation and make predictions based on that analysis. That's at least the way I function.
Yes. Some addition, Edgar, or it's okay for you?
It's okay. I want to ask about education next.
Okay, just first of it, I will address a question from my students here. The question is from Jadna, and she asks, why do you think McLuhan is so misunderstood by many, even so its genius is proven today?
Why is McLuhan misunderstood? Well, he is hard to understand. He wrote in a less than straightforward way. One of his models was James Joyce, which is not exactly the way a scholar needs to proceed. He liked to pack lots of ideas. I mean, he had all these ideas, so they're all flowing out. One person described reading or even listening to McLuhan as trying to take a drink out of a fire hose. So it was just pouring out of him. And he also liked to pack things together into very tight, concentrated packages, which then require us to unpack them. So I think for a lot of these reasons, he was misunderstood. Some of it was the fact that he held back to some extent and didn't really reveal his views about the negative, his criticisms of media and technology that much. So some misunderstood him as being, as celebrating media and technology. But I also think that in his time and immediately, it's in the 70s and 80s, there was a deliberate effort to suppress McLuhan. And I don't say it as a conspiracy, but just that he had alienated people and he had angered people from different quarters, different directions, and they all pushed back at the same time. And some of it was based on his writing being too obscure, too hard to understand. Some of it was based on his personality, which was, he was not, while it's been said he was a very charming person, he also would be very dismissive of other people and not really engage them the way that you might want or expect. Very kind of almost monomaniacal and argumentative and all of that. Some of it was coming from on religious grounds because it was known that he was a Catholic convert and fairly zealous about his religion, although it was not overt in most of his writing. People recognized some of the religious currents and were not thrilled with that, or found that as inappropriate for the kind of scholarship he was engaged in. Quite the contrast, by the way, to Walter Ong, who was a Jesuit priest, was impeccable as a scholar, and so much so that Walter Ong was president of, I guess it was in the 70s, of the Modern Language Association, which is quite remarkable to have a Jesuit priest as president of a rather kind of radical, in some ways, academic group. But also, I think the folks who were committed to science and social science thought McLuhan was just not scientific and not, not appropriate enough. I mean, he stepped on a lot of toes as far as being, just being extremely interdisciplinary at a time when that was not in favor. So, I think there were a lot of things, and they weren't coordinated efforts, and people were jealous of his celebrity, his fame and I don't know how great a fortune, but you know, most academics toil in obscurity, and I think there was that as well. So there are a lot of reasons why.
Well, thank you, Jadina, for your question, and thank you, Lance, for your answer, because it's important to clear this up with many reasons that you did, but because there is a prejudice even in Brazil, even today, against McLuhan in some fields or some approach. Thank you very much for this response. Edgar Lyra, it's up to you.
Okay, to go beyond the discussion of technical solution to the present climate problems, I think we will have to tackle the question of education. In the beginnings of media ecology studies in 1970s, Neil Postman discussed the reform of North American high school. He defined at that time media ecology as a field of inquiry and stressed that, I quote, "In the school of the future, subjects, as we usually think of them, will have very little value." My question is, how much attention is today being given by media ecologists to the question of basic education? And I would be very thankful if you can make a brief of this Postman conception of basic education.
Well, I would say that, you know, when you say basic, you mean elementary and secondary, you know, K through 12 education. Is that what you mean, as opposed to college?
I'm talking about high school specifically.
Okay. So, in all honesty, I don't think very much attention is being paid to high school education, aside from any high school teachers who happen to connect to us. So I do hear about this. I actually, you know, a while back, I was contacted by a woman who was working on a play based on Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. And she explained that she'd been introduced to Postman's writings in high school. So her teacher had introduced that. But we haven't really paid a lot of attention to that. I think that, you know, in some ways it tends to build off of more basic conceptions about communication. So sometimes it feels like you have to start earlier, or start with other matters before moving on. That media ecology is a kind of meta discipline in some ways. I think that when it has been, you know, it has come into play somewhat within media literacy, that some folks in media literacy incorporate media ecology. And the media literacy folks are interested in high school and earlier forms of education. So I do think that's an area that we could probably do a lot better in, though. Now, Postman specifically was very involved in that, and he came from, his degree was from Columbia University's Teachers College, and it was an EDD, a Doctor of Education. And he started out with trying to create new kinds of English curriculum. You know, that's the subject, or sometimes called language arts, or and a lot of it was based on understanding what language is. The first book that he did, well, actually the very first book he did was Television and the Teaching of English. And then I was just going back to it for a piece I was working on. The first book he co-authored with Charles Weingartner was on linguistics. And it was the idea that English teachers should teach linguistics and understand that. And that also involves, a major part of that is understanding how symbols work, what I think most people today would refer to as semiotics or semiology, but coming out of a somewhat different tradition with I.A. Richards and also general semantics. So the period that you're bringing up, that Postman was involved in, that was a time, and was part of the larger counterculture and movements for change of the 60s and early 70s, and there were calls for educational reform that were going on then. And at that time, Postman was following McLuhan's lead, who was saying that schools need to readjust because they were based on old technology, rooted in print and mechanical industrial thinking, and they needed to readjust to better work with the new electronic environment. But by the end of the 70s, Postman had shifted his view. So he went from teaching as a subversive activity in 1969 to teaching as a conserving activity in 1979, arguing that kids don't need any more help adjusting to the electronic media environment, to the world of television. That is the most powerful curriculum we have, and that needs to be countered now by schools, and who should emphasize kind of print-based curriculum that that's being obsolesced. And and that actually seems to be the stronger analysis, because it does feel like we are losing so much of literate culture, and so much of what really the modern world was based on. That it was based on print, I agree with him. They're different analyses, though. So some media ecologists don't like that. And some folks in the field say, this is good. What we're doing here is good. We should use online education. That there are real advantages, which is true. That there are real benefits to online education. And we should use them because they add so much to what we're doing. And then there are others who are saying that the essence of education is being co-present and reading and talking, and that's what we should be emphasizing. So those are two different positions within the field that have emerged. I'm more in the co-present sense, in that more conserving view. But I also recognize the importance of this, and that I go back to what's appropriate. What do we have available? What can we do? What works best for our purposes? I forget if that really answered your other question, Edgar.
That we can't educate mere users.
repeat, please, Edgar. Your talk was cut in the beginning, please.
My only certainty is that we can't educate mere users of technology. We can use technology, but you have to invite the youth to think of what we're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And Mcclellan had a good point that to really be able to do that, and when we understand media technology as an environment, you know, he pointed to we need counter environments, anti-environments, you know, the place where you step out of this environment and into a different kind of environment. And that helps you in the same way that when you travel and you go to another culture, you not only pay attention to things, ordinary things you take for granted, but when you return, at least for a little while, your own culture suddenly seems strange and you're aware of things that you used to take for granted. So that, you know, that's where we need to find the ways to step out of this environment. And he liked art as a counter environment. He felt that art helps us to see things differently. Now, Postman pointed to the classroom and traditional education as at least potentially a counter environment. I think religion, you know, religious kind of experiences, going to church, synagogue, mosque, these are environments that are old and based on a different media sensibility, a different sensory sensibility. So it's not so much the content of the religion as the experience of it. Obviously, nature, you know, is going into, you know, as such as we can find it, because I mean, even a park, you know, we think of going to farms as nature, but I think in Brazil you're more aware of it than we are in the U.S. That farming is technological and it is a manipulation and destruction of the real environment. But to the extent that we can get out of whatever our everyday environment is and find the way to step out, that's what we need. Good friend of mine, my old another media ecology scholar, Robert Albrecht, just did a book on art and play in education. You know, that his argument is for art and play, and he likes to, you know, in particular, and he actually has a lot of experience just coming with a guitar and teaching kids, you know, just to sing, because we just, especially in the U.S., we just don't do that. He did another study a long time ago. That was a book he published a while back. I'll put his name in, you can look it up. But it was based on research done in Brazil, where he looked at the difference between musical experience through generations and just the loss of that direct experience of music, because we experience it as recordings and, you know, on broadcasts and, you know, I guess through streaming. So for example, everyone used to be able to sing, you know, some people, some not so well, but everyone sang. And people had vast repertoires of songs that they knew, that they could sing. And now, you know, when you ask people, you know, kids, you know, sing songs, and they might know a few lines from a popular song, but they don't know it entirely, you know, that they've forgotten that. And so something like those, you know, those kinds of experiences are what we need to pull us out of the, as you would put it, Edgar, the user environment, and into a different kind of environment, a more human environment.
Thank you, Lance. Thank you,
very
Edgar.
much.
And it's for about this author that Lance mentioned, Robert Albrecht. I've just translated with Jadna, my student here. We translated his paper to be published the next week in our journal, aconteceu, in a new section called Translations. So I translated with the help of Jadna this piece, and it will be available. The title is The Seesaw Principle, the art and play as a counterbalance in digital era. So it will be available in our journal soon, okay?
I got to read for sure.
And I have here from, but you want to say something, Edgar, more about this issue? Because I have some questions here.
No, I'm satisfied. Well.
Okay. So I have here a question from Paola. Paola, do you want to say by your own, or should I read it? I think I'll read it. So Paola, my student, said, the fake news were relevant tools in the United States and Brazil electoral results. How can understand about digital media, how digital media help us to predict and possibly control block actions in our society?
How can, what's this, the last part?
The fake news were tools in Brazil and electoral results. How can we understand digital media? How digital media can help us to predict and possibly control or block actions in our society?
But what actions are we trying to block in?
I think she's talking about fake news, for example. Disinformation.
Well, I guess so. First, there's the question of what is fake news, and you know, and that's something that you know, kind of makes me cringe, along with Donald Trump, all of Donald Trump, every aspect of him, for which I profoundly apologize, as just on behalf of the United States for this, and I hope we can rectify the situation before too long. If not, I may come join you in Brazil. But fake news, there's just this phrase that Trump seized upon and just repeats endlessly. And it's just part of his sort of like bullshit. I mean, bullshitting to, you know, there's no other way to put it. I think originally when that phrase was introduced, it was referring to parody news. I don't know if you're aware of, for example, The Onion, which is just a kind of website that produces just made up news that's meant to be funny, that's just silly and outrageous. And that was originally what was, as I understand it, what the term referred to. But we can really, I think this is a good point to bring in Daniel Boorstin. And he was a kind of someone we include in media ecology, but not in the top tier. So he's usually often not mentioned. He was a historian. He was actually the Librarian of Congress at one point, which is sort of like, for scholarship, the equivalent of the poet laureate, you know, that he was the leading scholar for the United States. And he was a bit on the conservative side, or sort of like on the Republican side, but at the time when Republicans were not crazy, but were just, had a bit off before Reagan and all that. But anyway, he wrote a very influential book called The Image. And a term that he introduced in that was pseudo-event. I guess I'll put that in the chat just so. And he explained that that newspapers, going back to the introduction of news, that newspapers used to report on events. So an event is an accident, like say a train crash, a hurricane, an earthquake. That's a real event. Something happened. It would have happened whether or not there was news media to cover that event. And he explains that what happens in the early 19th century, by the end of the 1820s, steam power is applied to the printing press, and that makes it possible to produce mass circulation newspapers. Before that point, print is done by hand. They're just doing it by hand, and that limited the circulation, took a lot more time. But suddenly, I imagine you're all familiar with the images of those big printing presses running off newspapers. It's a bit old-fashioned now, but that is what emerges by 1830. And that makes it possible to mass produce newspapers in enormous quantities and very cheaply. In the US, this led to, it was referred to as the penny press, the daily newspaper that only cost a penny. And the problem, and here's the general media ecological principle, you create a new medium, but now we need content to fill it. And so comes the struggle, where do we get content for it? And the old sense of reporting on events, well, there just aren't enough events. There aren't enough interesting things that happen to report on. And so that leads to the initiative to create content, especially for newspapers, and then later for other news media. So what are pseudo events? The first one is the interview. Right? Interviews only happen because there's an interviewer to interview somebody. They're not real events that would have happened otherwise. And he points to others, the publicity stunt. Now this is coming from outside of the news media, but it's like some business or individual figures, well, they're looking for content. I'll create an event. And he used the example of a hotel that's not doing so well, so they create a big, like 30th anniversary celebration. And they do it to get coverage, which then helps the hotel's business. They wouldn't have done it otherwise if not for wanting to get that coverage. And that spawns other pseudo-events. The press release, which is written for the papers, in the style of the paper, to get reproduced in the paper. The press conference. And that leads later on to the news leak. And related kind of things, they're called like the trial balloon and the background briefing. Right? And and news leak, we were told such and such information. From whom? Or sources close to the president said, and then the whole thing is, well, is it true? What do we know about it? And then when you turn around and you look at what accounts for most of the content of news media, almost all of it is not a real event. Almost none of it would have happened if the media were not around to report it. And you can even tell when a real event is happening, like a hurricane. Do you guys get hurricanes in Brazil? Do they come to, no, earthquakes? What do you, no,
Nope.
Fires? Well, I mean, when we see the coverage of these kinds of things, or an accident, you certainly get, you see that it's not like well produced. You know, the cameras, they don't get a good shot. They don't know where to go. They don't know what's happening, right? It's not made for TV or made for reporting. So in this sense, almost all of what accounts for news is, in a sense, fake news. Now, this is not to minimize the abuse of the term by Donald Trump and by others, but the fact is that much of what accounts for news reporting is in some way questionable, because when you don't know who it's coming from or what is being said or what it means or what difference it makes for anybody, then it is, just that ambiguity means it's not real in a certain sense. And then the ambiguity is what's really interesting about it. It's like, well, what does that mean? Is it going to happen? What will be? We just went through Trump naming a Supreme Court justice. I mean, we could say, okay, naming the justice is the real event, right? That's something that happened. It would be a political act that would occur whether or not anything was going on. But there was all this speculation and discussion leading up to it. Will he, won't he, who will it be? Even the day before, there was this sort of like, under the table announcement of who it was going to be without it being official. So, so much of this is already questionable. And what can we do then? That when we get to digital media, I mean, and of course, that's the brilliance of digital media, is that they no longer have to produce or find the content. They just said, let the audience be its own content. Let the audience fill up. And this was like a crisis in the 90s. After the web was introduced, all these websites went up, and businesses, corporations started to put up websites, and all of a sudden content became the buzzword. So we need content. So what the hell? You go to a website, you look at it, you don't come back, you saw it, right? What keeps people coming back? And that's where, they called it Web 2.0, and then social networking, social media. That's where it saved the web, in a sense, by creating, allowing for user-generated content. So how do we stop it? Paula, is that really what you want to know? Like, what do we do about that? That's really, that's turned into a real problem. And it is possible for the big companies to put in rules and put in limitations as part of the setup. But, otherwise, it's led to users saying and doing what they want. Paula, you unmuted there, so what were you going to say?
Who?
I thought Paula wasn't that your question, Paula?
Paula. Yes, I have two questions here, one from Fernando and one from... Paula, yours is about disinformation as well? Is your question about disinformation, fake news, or no?
No.
So, Fernando,
That's not my question. Question of order.
Fernando.
Adriana, sorry, the question about fake news is mine.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Did I answer that or?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Professor.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Fernando, are you here? Fernando want to make a question on this information as well. Fernando, are you there?
I see him.
I have to open up. Oh, sorry. I have to open up his mic. Sorry.
I think that it's okay, no?
Oh, yeah. You are here. Welcome, Fernando. Fernando were in NEA convention in 2019 in Toronto, isn't it?
Yes, and this year also.
Okay, thank you, Fernando. Go ahead.
Thank you, Adriana. Thank you, Lance. I will continue asking about the information, but with a little change. Early this year, I was reading Amusing Yourself to Death, and I was surprised by Postman talk about disinformation in the media environment in the 80s. And since then, I was trying to understand how to relate this idea of disinformation with the contemporary idea of disinformation. So, Lance, I would ask you how we can handle with the concept of change in media environments. We use new media, or as Paul Levinson say, new media, but how far goes the idea of new media? What's really new, what stay, what has a little change, and how can we understand this difference and this change between the one environment and another one?
Okay. First of all, he used the term information environment, but he, Postman was not trying to develop a consistent sort of philosophy or theoretical approach across his different books. So sometimes he would use this term or sometimes that term, whatever seemed to fit. And he was always sort of had his eye on a practical question and how to best make an argument in a given context. So we can certainly understand that he's talking about a media environment. I did earlier say that the idea of new media comes about as a way to distinguish them, new forms of mediated or technologically mediated communication, to distinguish them from mass communication and mass media, so that if it's not mass media, it's new media, which is a format that can include mass communication, also includes interpersonal communication, and also includes many-to-many communication in a way that didn't exist before. It also breaks down the traditional distinction between producers and consumers, or source and audience, that gets kind of equalized. But to your question of changing media environments, my recommendation is to not get too fixed on the terms and on the concepts. So if we want to say, and I like to refer to the electronic media environment, because for me, the characteristics going back to the telegraph inform everything that we see today, and that much of what we see, in terms of our media today, can be understood as based on the basic characteristics of electricity and electric technology. I think there's a continuity there, and I find that useful for me in my thinking and to explain what that's about. However, we can also, I know that there are other folks in the field of media ecology who want to argue that no, the old electronic media environment that they associated with broadcasting is entirely different from this new media environment with the internet, the web, and of course social media. That's a different media environment. And I wouldn't argue with that, because I just say that there are different levels. So on a higher level, the electronic media environment is the general designation. Within that, we can get to more specific media environments. It's that same idea of abstracting I talked about before. There are different ways to go through it. So if we want to get it down to more specific and more concrete, lower on the abstracting ladder level, then we can talk about the media environment of Brazil in 2020, right? And that is a specific media environment that's different from the media environment in the US in 2020, and not the least because we speak different languages. Or we could talk about Facebook as a media environment, and what are the characteristics of that environment. Or more generally, social media as a sort of social media environment, and just focus on that and ask those characteristics. So I see it as a very flexible term that we use. It's a way to try to think about our media and technology, and thinking about it not as these sort of like gadgets that I may choose to use or not use, but as something that we're living inside of, and that's always surrounding us and influencing us in the way that the environment influences us, which is not cause and effect, sort of mechanistic kinds of influence, but rather setting constraints, kind of setting up paths of least resistance, and then within that environment, things happen, things emerge. So that's the way I see it. Does that answer your question?
It's okay, Fernando, for you. Thank you, Lance.
Thank you.
I will call Paola to ask her question. Paola.
Yes.
Okay.
Are you listening?
Yeah.
Yes. I have two questions, but at first, well, today the media supports the global circuits of economical exchange on which the entire world, movement of information, knowledge, capital, investment, production, trade of raw materials, and marketing of products and ideas depend. The new nervous systems that enmesh societies with different stories, different ways of life, in different stages of development and located in different time zones have effects. One effect of this space-time compression is the tendency towards cultural homogenization, the tendency for the world to become a place unique, both from a spatial, temporal, and cultural point of view. The syndrome that a theorist called McDonaldization of the globe, homogenized, westernized world culture. What do you think?
Oh, okay. In some ways, this brings me back to that piece I did, Adriana, the piece on nationalism that is on eCampus, is it?
Yes, published in eCompass Journal, Fall of
Nation. So I think that yes and no. I think, one of the things in media ecology, and one of the reasons why you have to really study a lot to do it properly, and if you don't, you wind up with the kinds of things that some people see as kind of technological determinism, sort of these kinds of oversimplifications. So we can clearly see the homogenizing effect, right? Do you have Starbucks? You have Starbucks over there? Yeah, you have McDonald's. I mean, I had McDonald's in Shanghai, and so.
As well.
Yeah, I mean, so we see this, and McLuhan's colleague Edmund Carpenter put it very nicely. He said, I think media swallow cultures whole, right? They don't play favorites. It's not like American culture swallowing, other countries, because it's McDonald's and Starbucks are not American culture, right? I mean, they are something else that is swallowed up America, and then the disease spread to other places. So on one level, yes, there is a homogenizing effect, and part of that effect is antithetical to national culture. But to really understand this, we have to go back and say, well, where did national culture come from, and the idea of the nation come from? And that was a homogenizing effect of printing. That if we go back far enough, and we really have to go back to the old world, not us young countries, but back over in Europe, and they had to create nations out of many localities. And in some places, it didn't quite take hold. Like Italy is sort of like teetering, because they never quite eliminated the sort of local tribal loyalties between the different regions. Germany was also relatively late, although they were much stronger in their homogenizing effort, but other countries, I mean, we see Spain, this is another example. Spain had to suppress the Basque and the Catalan, right? Any Catalan there? And in order to create a kind of homogenized culture. So what happens now, what's happening now, is that while there is this sort of, if you like, superficial element of globalization going on, what it really hurts is national culture. But what that allows is national culture was keeping down the local cultures, right? And suddenly they're springing up because of that effect of globalization. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, Scotland wants to leave the UK. That's pretty extraordinary when you think about, about that sort of thing. So that's why I think, just sort of the simplistic, we're losing like national identity. I mean, which is true, but it's not just that we're getting a global identity, but we're unleashing the localism that didn't exist before, and in some places it never took hold. A nation like Iraq never had a national identity. They were sort of like created, in the post-war climate, and they put together, they've got like 3 distinct groups of people, and they barely held together. I think if the U.S. hadn't put all this pressure on it, after the invasion, they would have broken apart into three different countries. What happened in Yugoslavia? I wonder if people even know the name Yugoslavia anymore. But I mean, Czechoslovakia. Anyone remember Czechoslovakia? And this is a trend that we're seeing, and some places are just held together by force. Look at China I mean, Tibet, the Uyghurs in the other part. They're being very forceful at preventing those kind of forces. But if we want to say, well, what is the general thrust of things? It is to undo nationalism in favor of more localism. So, and you brought up, you said like space and time, and I have been trying to get around to working on a book about cyber time, which was an essay I wrote a long time ago. But I think the same thing happens, like we're not on the same time zone, right? You guys are not in the right time, because it's like almost 2 o'clock for me and it's almost 3 o'clock for you, right? That's wrong, right? You guys are not in the correct time zone, because for me, the center of the world is the Eastern time. But and that was created out of that was made possible by the telegraph. You couldn't have time zones without the telegraph. It was the railroads that spurred it on. Do you know the story about? It was in the U.S. There were all these railroad accidents because you just have one track. You don't have like two parallel tracks like in commuter trains. You have one track, and then the trains are coming from different directions, and you have places where they can go off to the side occasionally. But they couldn't coordinate the time because, say, I'll give my example, New York and Philadelphia. It's probably Rio and Sao Paulo are different times. But like New York and Philadelphia, I don't know. New York and Philadelphia are the same time zone today, but Philadelphia is a little to the west of New York. And how do people set the time? The only thing you can set it on is high noon. That's the one kind, unless you're on the equator, high noon is the only thing that doesn't vary from one day to another. So everyone sets their clocks differently, and the trains don't know what time they're on, and they collide. And how do you get New York and Philadelphia to set their clocks to the exact same time? You have to go faster than a speeding bullet or a train, and that's the telegraph made that possible. The telegraph made it possible to send a signal at noon, whichever noon you're going to take, and have everyone coordinate on that signal. And it was the railroad companies that created the first time zones in the US, the first ever. And then they asked the government to take it over. The US government took it over. And then eventually it went to the whole world, that the rest of the world picked up on it and created time zones. And they work fine in the old media environment where there wasn't much communication from place to place. It eliminated local time, right? You no longer had the, a city no longer had the freedom to set the time the way they wanted to. And everyone had to follow their time zone, which can be really weird. India is on the half hour. You ever see like the time in India? It's like half hour off. It's part of the reason because they want to try to create a uniform time for their nation, but it puts them half an hour off from the rest of the world. Anyway, it becomes very hard to coordinate. So ultimately, we're going to have a global time. It makes sense. It might be Greenwich Mean Time, or there was a thing for a while called Swatch time. You could look it up. The Swatch company introduced it. But eventually we'll have global time, homogenize it, because it's too unwieldy. You have to figure out, well, okay, and is it daylight savings time or not? That gets it even more complicated. How do we do this, right? So we'll have a global time, and that'll free up the possibility of having local time again, too. So I just put this forth as a principle that when you have something new coming in from on top, it undoes what's directly below it, but we also have to ask, what was that holding down? Right? What was that keeping suppressed? Because that can then come back up.
Thank you, Lance.
Do you have another question?
Yes, there are lots of questions here. I will read two, and then you
Answer which one I want.
One by one, okay? But I will read two. Is it okay for you? Okay.
Yeah.
Adriana Lago, my student, master student, asked, how do you see artificial intelligence and technologies like VR, RV, virtual, augmented reality impact on the media and society relationship?
Oh, I like that.
Yes, and the other.
Well, Adriana should turn her camera on.
Pardon?
Your students should turn her camera on, just so we know who's asking the question.
Yes, Adriana, please turn your camera. Adriana Lago, let me see her here. I will do.
One of these features of this medium is that you don't know if people are really there or not.
Yes, yes. Adriana Lago, are you there? Oh, I think she's gone. Oh, here she is here. Adriana?
Well, why don't you go ahead with the next question while you were.
Oi. Hi.
She's here. Where are you?
Eu não sei o que tá acontecendo.
Oh, well.
Yeah. Okay. The second question is from Rafael. He presented an MEA convention last year, this year as well. And his question is, in Brazil, we are dealing with a great problem of media oligopolies and concentration of information. In the US, it is prohibited by law. In your point of view, do you agree with this kind of regulation in order to avoid information monopoly?
Okay.
Rafael. Rafael is here.
Okay.
Hello, I'm here.
Yeah. Well, that's that's a question that starts to take us, I think, outside of a lot of media ecology and into other kinds of concerns, which are very legitimate concerns. But that when we start to get into the business of media, and that did come up before about what isn't media ecology. I mean, we can get into it from a media ecological point of view, but a lot of this is sort of like is a basic political position, and we can say that under certain circumstances, having a monopoly is more efficient. The U.S. for a long time had telephone as a private monopoly, but controlled by the government. At other times, of course, in Europe, public broadcasting for a long time was a monopoly. And I think, in a sort of ecological sense, we do want to have checks and balances to exercise control over these elements. And the question was about oligarchies, right? Media oligarchies, and so I'm talking about, for example, the Rupert Murdoch kind of thing. Is that right? Is that what we're getting at? Yes, no?
Pardon, Rafael?
You
could just like signal yes or no.
Yes, no, yes. I have, yes.
Okay.
I have some difficulty.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we might start to look at is how communication media, communication technologies affect organization, human organization more generally, and so allow for more kind of horizontal kind of spread in a in terms of organization, but and the other part is the financial question, which again, I mean, it's not one that I take up a lot, and it's not to dismiss the importance. It's just me personally that I don't take that up a lot. But there are questions about the extent to which the forms of communication that we're using make possible the movement of currency and even undermine certain kinds of currency, and how that also affects the financial picture. I mean, speaking personally from my personal political sense, I mean, for oligarchies, immediately is a negative term, and where obviously when it comes to this sort of thing, there is a concern about too much power in the hands of too few people, and that has long been the case. One of the arguments in favor of new media has been that it has undone that to some extent, that it puts people on more of an equal footing when we can all produce our own video and put it on YouTube and people can watch it, that it has had actually quite a lot of democratizing effect. But at the same time, we're seeing that the control over the means of that, like who owns Google, who owns YouTube, that has been moving in another direction. But I think overall it's been harder to control, and that's been a positive thing. But it just lets the genie out of the bottle in the sense that you get the crazy stuff too. You get the evil stuff sort of springing forth because there's not enough control, suppressing it. When there were less opportunity, let's say in the U.S., when we had the three big networks, you didn't have a Murdoch. You couldn't have a Murdoch. It's a financial model that wouldn't work because it would alienate the majority of the audience. Now we have more sources. You have a Murdoch, and unfortunately, part of the problem is not simply the ideology, but just the production values and the way that they go about it, which the left has always been bad at this sort of thing. I don't know if they should be good or not. I mean, I feel like I'm sort of fumphering around here because I don't have a good answer for you, except that personally I'm not in favor of oligarchies, and I think it's certainly been harmful here in to the extent that we've had the Murdoch kind of forces in play. But I think it's too soon to tell the ultimate disposition of this, because everything's changing, so everything's getting mixed up, so I guess I'll leave it at that. I know it's not a great answer, but.
Oh, thank you, Lance.
Okay, but the augmented reality question, I more to say. Yeah.
Adriana.
Oh, there she is. Yeah. Okay. So I think, and I think, first of all, virtual reality, which has been around longer, is interesting, but has limited utility because it's just not that easy or not that comfortable to be completely immersed in an artificial environment and cut off from your surroundings. these things can kind of create problems. And by the way, a great point someone made about virtual reality is that the first virtual reality technology, or at least widely used one, was stereo. Stereo recordings and stereo players, because it was the whole idea of, well, you have two ears, you hear from two directions, so that recreates reality. We often overlook the audio component and only pay attention when the visual part is added to it. But, so if you want to see what's coming, pay attention to the audio media. But I think augmented reality is really important, and I see that as being very significant for the future. Again, look at it historically. The analogy is with writing. We have written over our physical environment. Street signs, building names, just wherever you go, there's writing all over the place. Advertisements. We've just papered over the world with writing. And that helps us to figure out where we are, where we're going, that sort of thing. And how, to think about just driving around without any signs, or trying to find a building or home without having an address. Which, by the way, I heard that when we first occupied Iraq, that was a problem when they were trying to find these terrorists, or the insurgents in Baghdad, that there were many places that didn't have an address, right? It's not like a necessary thing that you have a street name and a street address. So we have redone the world through a literate kind of overlay, put a literate overlay on the world, and we're now in the process of doing the same thing digitally through augmented reality. So I think that is going to be extremely significant in the future.
Okay, thank you, Lance. Now going back to the education. Thank you, Adriana. Going back to the education, where I have a student, but she's a PhD in education, and she is in my this discipline as well. And she asks, I will address her question. The perspective of media ecology takes transdisciplinarity into account. Would this be the ideal way for education, primary school more specifically, to be able to approach the media in a more organic and effective way in its curriculum?
Could you repeat it?
Yeah. Beginning again. The perspective of media ecology takes transdisciplinary into account. Would this be the ideal way of education, primary school more specifically, to be able to approach the media in a more organic and effective way and in its curriculum?
Yeah.
Mirna is the one who asks.
Okay, I see. I'm in Mirna.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi. So it's an interesting question, and it's something that educators have struggled with. There's a famous kind of bit of recording of Gregory Bateson talking about this, and he says that that people believe that there's such a thing of psychology that's distinct and separate from anthropology, that's distinct and separate from sociology. And he says, I don't live in such a world, and as for you, you can live in whatever world you want to. And I don't know who came up with it. I know Postman used the phrase, McLuhan did too, that educational schools suffer from the hardening of the categories, which was a play on an old phrase, the hardening of the arteries. Just actual disease or arteriosclerosis. But anyway, it's so hard to say because there's this other part that you have to have a foundation. And one of the problems with being interdisciplinary is that it becomes, and in academia, and I mean, I may be insulting some people, I don't know, but it becomes a way to insulate yourself from any real critical evaluation, because it's like, well, I'm doing some anthropology, but I'm not an anthropologist, so you can't criticize me for that. And I'm doing some psychology, but I'm not a psychologist. I'm not in that discipline, so you can't criticize me for that. I'm interdisciplinary. And that is, you know, it becomes almost a kind of insulation. In fact, in my book, in the my media ecology book, which I have the background here for, you know, I actually go into this a little bit because I think there's a distinction between being interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. And multidisciplinary means actually mastering different disciplines, not just sort of like jumping across them. You know, and that's the danger of being superficial in the way that we combine them, but actually, you know, having a strong foundation in more than one discipline. And, you know, by definition, communication is like that. But again, people don't necessarily actually receive that strong foundation once they come through it. So I would go back to, well, we've got to focus on reading and writing and arithmetic. We've got to get the basics done, and that they're harder to do than ever before. But what I would say is that in doing that, we should add that upper level of understanding what is reading, you know, how does it work, you know, what is writing, what is, you know, how do these different kinds of symbol systems and modes of communication work. I think one of the big questions coming up, if it's not come up exactly yet, it's certainly on the about to. Well, one of the questions we're dealing with right now, should we teach script, cursive? In the US, there are school districts that stop doing that. And I think if you know, making this decision, you know, let's say we should teach cursive, but we should also explain why we're doing it and what it is, what does it mean? Yeah, which also includes being able to read other people's writing and script, because otherwise you're cut off. What I was going to say, one of the questions that will be coming up is, should we teach the clock face? Less and less of our display of time comes with the clock face. Do we need to make that something that we teach early on? And, you know, let's say, I mean, I kind of like doing that because I had to learn it. But, you know, we should also explain, well, you know, let's understand that it models the passage of the sun, that it allows us to see all the times at once in potential, not just one moment in time, that it sees things continually rather than one point at a time. And in this way, we can teach the difference between analogical and digital forms of representation, because that's the difference, that's the distinction. So that's where I would go with that.
Thank you, Lance. Edgar Lyra, I bet that you have another question about education. Go ahead.
No, I don't have another question. I just want to thank Lance Strate for his generosity and I want to hear more in other occasions. I have read his book or his article, The Human Condition, as the subject of media ecology investigation that is being based on Hannah Arendt. And as a guy I have studied Hannah Arendt for a very long time, and I should congratulate you by the clarity of the article. And it's not only Hannah Arendt. The starting point is Hannah Arendt, and you have lots of other thinkers related to Hannah Arendt in the article. And I think there is a book you have written that is a kind of complete appropriation of the question of the human condition. I want to have opportunity to read the whole book. I just want to congratulate you by your work in this direction. It's brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I don't have another question, Adriana.
Okay, thank you, Edgar. Some more questions? Some more questions?
Well, there's one in the chat that's a rather long one.
Luís Mauro, people from the audience?
Well, just to thank you, Professor Strate. Once again, it was really a pleasure to listen to you, to hear from your words and your research. And Adriana, thank you very much again for inviting me for that. That was really enlightening. And Professor, that was really amazing, truly amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Unfortunately, I have to leave right now. I'm sorry for that. As Edgar said, I would listen for hours and hours.
Sure.
Unfortunately, some other things press me for a leave now. But thank you very much for your words, Adriana. Thank you very much. There are words that only in our native language can express everything. So, Professor Lance, if I can share one of these words, is valeu. With this sort of intonation, expressing a deep admiration for your colleague and a deep gratitude for the invitation. So, Adriana, once again, valeu. Obrigadão. Thank you very much, and nice meeting to everyone else.
Thank you very much, Luís Mauro, for your partnership. And I think we are only in the very beginning of it. Your collaboration in the preface of the book is fantastic. I like too much. And this book inspires all the discipline. So thank you for that as well. And thank you for this conversation with us today.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye. There is just time for one question. If someone...
Well, Paula, there's a question in the chat from Paula.
Paula, is it the same questions that you did before?
No, it's another one.
It's about blocking apps. And so I just want to, I can just say really quickly to that these are sort of rear guard efforts, just like trying to censor the press was a response to the press. These sort of political efforts and policy efforts are always reacting to the media, to the introduction of new media. They're never anticipating anything. They don't know how to anticipate. And in this sense, I would just say that they're doomed to failure. That there is no way to block these things. They can block them to some extent, but not completely. And they couldn't block them in Hong Kong. They're not going to block them in the US. You find ways with a VPN or whatever, you find ways to access these things. By the way, I have WeChat. I don't have TikTok, but I have WeChat on my phone. I got it a long time ago. You know, so they're trying to block people from downloading it for the first time. But, you know, it was like in Hong Kong, I know now there's a really bad crackdown, but earlier, some years earlier, when they had the big protests, and they couldn't communicate via SMS or the internet because it was being monitored, and they picked up a new app called FireChat, I believe it was, that used Bluetooth connections to spread messages through all phones that are connected in a locality, you know, in a local area. And it's one of the basic features of electronic media is that they are out of our control. They're very hard to impose absolute control over because you can't stop a broadcast, you can't stop signals coming through the air. And so they really defy the efforts that were possible when you could block people and print media at a border. You can set up, you know, border control. You can't do that with electronic media, at least not in the same sense. So that's my answer.
Okay.
Trump's a jerk. I mean, that's the other part. I mean, he's an idiot and evil, and we just hope and pray that he'll be gone soon.
Let me see here. It's okay for you, Paola? Okay. Okay, Paola, I think she's here. Yeah. So I think we are in the end of this lovely meeting, this special meeting. Thank you, all of you, for this insightful afternoon and for this lovely audience. And thank you for my students. And I will make a publicity here. I encourage all of you to send your proposals for the next Media Ecology Association Convention, the annual meeting. We are the host of the next convention in PUC-Rio, if it's possible. But I invite all of you to send your proposal. It's 250 words, an abstract of 250 words, and it's open until November 1st, okay? And I encourage all of you to gather, to come along with us to discuss all those transdisciplinary issues so important for us. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lance, for your generosity, for your company, your partnership, okay, your friendship. Thank you very much. And thank you, Edgar Lyra, Luís Mauro, and all of you. Thank you. All there are different people here that I want to thank, but thank all of you, and see you next in the next opportunity, okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Adriana, and the partnership.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.